Hello, my name is Christine Lanfear, and I'm going to lead you through an overview of the content standards for world languages for the state of California. In this section of our exploration of the standards, we're going to be focusing on the organization of the standards. Specifically, the fact that there are 5 categories of standards: content, communication, cultures, structures, and settings. Each of the categories contains one or more elements, most of them about 3 or 4, and each category contains descriptors for student proficiency for each element across the stages from stage 1 through stage 4. Beginning with content, content is a wide variety of topics that are age and stage appropriate. These terms, age and stage appropriate, are especially important because in California public schools, students can conceivably begin their study of world language at any number of different age levels. For example, you might have a student who is enrolled in a dual immersion program starting in kindergarten. Or you might have a student who begins studying Spanish or French at 9th grade. The topics, the content that you're going to address with a kindergartner may differ from the content that you would approach with a 9th grade student. Likewise, it's important that the content that we address with our students is stage appropriate. If they are an absolute novice and in stage 1, we can't approach as many abstract concepts as we would with a stage 3 or a stage 4 learner. Beginning with stage 1 content on pages 5 through 7, you're going to see that element 1.1 states that students address discrete elements of daily life, and that would be things that pertain specifically to their activities, things that pertain to the self and their immediate environment, not looking at more abstract concepts which will come in the other stages, stage 2, stage 3, etc. I've got a list here of a few of the items in the list of possible stage 1 content, such as greetings and introductions, family and friends, describing pets, describing their home and their neighborhood, talking about celebrations that are important to them, and the calendar, seasons, and weather. Again, all of these things are things that affect the learner directly. If you look, for example, at the item C, pets, and you go across from stage 1 to stage 4, you're going to see that what happens as you move from stage to stage is that the content becomes ever more abstract and global. So you might talk about pets as a stage 1 learner. You might be able to talk about the zoo and farm animals that might not be directly in your environment in stage 2. Then once you get to stage 3, you can start to talk about globally animals and their habitats. Maybe not, you don't live in that habitat, but you can start discussing it. And finally, endangered species, which is usually quite an abstract topic. As we move to the communication standard, we're going to see that the basis of communication is the conveying and receiving of messages in various formats. There are 3 modes of communication: interpersonal, meaning a shared activity between language users. This can be oral and written. Interpretive, meaning that language is understood. This can be a listening activity, this could be a viewing activity, or a reading activity, but there is not an interaction. And finally, presentational. This would be, for example, speaking or signing if you're using American Sign Language, and of course, writing in culturally appropriate ways. These 3 modes of communication may look familiar to you if you are aware of the national standards put out by ACTFL several years ago. They also talk about communication in these 3 modes. And that is not a coincidence, because the national standards from ACTFL were one of the documents that informed the development of the California World Language Standards. If you turn to page 8 in the standards document, you're going to see the stage 1 communication. And in 1.0, it says that students use formulaic languages, which is learned words, chunks, and phrases, and ASL signs in order to communicate. This is a very limited mode of communication. It does not involve creating language. That comes with stage 2. 1.1, they engage in oral and written conversations. 1.2, they interpret. And 1.3, they present. There are the 3 modes of communication. As you look at page 8, you're going to see that under all stages, stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, when you're at the point 1, point 2, point 3 element, it's identical. It does not change, because in all stages they engage in conversation, they interpret language, and they present language. What does change is the point 0 element, where the type of text type changes from formulaic language to created language to planned language, and finally extended language. On page 9, we start to see the communicative functions for the communication standard. These are the things that we want students to be able to do with language. For example, 1.4, they can list, name, identify, and enumerate in all 4 skills: reading, writing, listening, and speaking, and culture. This is a very typical production capability for a stage 1. 1.5, they can identify words and phrases in texts. They can't tell us what the text means yet, but they can identify the words and phrases they know. And finally, 1.6, they can reproduce and present a product in a culturally authentic way. This last one is sometimes a little bit difficult to grasp it, because we expect students to do their own work. But in reality, a stage 1 learner is only able to reproduce based on their observations of a prior artifact, for example. An example of this might be if you were doing a unit on food and dining in your target culture, you might actually show students an authentic menu from a restaurant from that culture. Then you ask them to create their own restaurant, and you're going to ask them to make a menu. They're not going to be creating an original menu. They're going to reproduce. They're going to imitate the menu they saw that you shared with them. They're going to demonstrate that they understand the culturally appropriate way to group food items on a menu, perhaps, to phrase how a menu item is called, or to price it and to have it priced in the appropriate currency. They're not creating something new. They are reproducing what they saw from you. Moving on to the culture standard. The culture standard highlights the relationship between products, practices, and perspectives. And the best way to think of these 3 pieces of culture is an iceberg. And there's a piece that is above the water that we can see. That's usually the products, the objects, the artifacts that are produced by the target culture, and the practices. How do they act? What do they do? How do they greet each other, etc. Perspectives are the underlying why do they do, or why do they produce, and they are what's underneath the water level, and they are quite vast and often hard to detect. They often are the biggest point of misunderstanding between cultures. You don't know why they are doing the particular action or why they are producing the particular product. Culture's standard also allows us to connect with a target culture, but also to make comparisons between our own culture and the target culture. And that's where some of the most fruitful and rich discussion can occur, but also where some of the largest misunderstandings can happen. If we turn to page 10 of the standards, we're going to see the stage 1 culture standard elements. 1.0, students can use appropriate responses in rehearsed cultural situations. They're not yet able to react to an unrehearsed or unexpected situation. 1.1, they can associate the products, practices, and perspectives with the target culture. So this is an identifying element. 1.2, they can recognize similarities and differences between the target culture and their own culture. And 1.3, they can identify cultural borrowings, meaning something that has come into our culture from another target culture. A really good example of that is the omnipresent nature of the piñata at children's birthday parties. That was not originally an American cultural symbol or product, but it has been borrowed into the, especially Californian culture. Moving on to the structures standard. The structure standard is the structure of language. This is not our end-all and be-all. In fact, structures is only one element of a functional objective. So we're going to look at the different elements of the structure. There's orthography, phonology, and parameters. Parameters are in American Sign Language, meaning where are signs made in relation to the body, up, down, left, right, in front of, etc. Morphology, the rules for word formation. Grammar and syntax, that's the rules of sentence structure. Semantics, which are language-based meaning systems, meaning there's some connotation, there's literal meaning, etc. And finally, pragmatics. Pragmatics is a meaning system that's connected to how you use the language, in what situations do you use the language, what contexts, the tone, the intonation, etc. If we turn to page 11 of the standards, we're going to look at the Stage 1 structures. Element 1.0 says that the students use orthography, meaning how things are spelled, phonology, what is the sound system that goes with the letters, and or the parameters of American Sign Language to understand words, signs, and phrases in context. That they are able to associate how something is spelled with how it sounds and ultimately make meaning. 1.1, they use those same structural elements to produce the words or phrases in context. So they can first understand and then they can produce. 1.2, they can identify similarities and differences in the orthography, phonology, or parameters of the languages that they know with the target language. So they can start to make some comparisons. They can see that things are either spelled similarly, things are spelled a little bit differently, how are the sounds and the letters different and similar. An interesting observation is to take a look at the rest of the stages in structures and to ask yourself, where do we see grammar appear? And if you take a look, you're going to first see grammar announced in Stage 2. This sometimes is a little confusing because we say, well, wait a minute, I do grammar in my level 1 class. You do grammar, but your student is not going to master grammar, is still going to struggle. In the here and now, they can manipulate it just fine, but when it becomes a spontaneous activity, they are still going to struggle. And that Stage 1 really is about the chunks of memorized language, not about grammar. It's not about conjugation of a verb. It's about learning the verb conjugation in a context and in a chunk. So, for example, a very beginning level 1 student is able to introduce themselves by saying, my name is. But they don't know that my name is a pronoun and a verb in a certain conjugation. They just know it as a chunk of language. Now moving to the settings standard. The setting is where does the student use the language and in what context does the student use the language. So there are a variety of situations or locations and a variety of contexts in which they might be using language. And the situations that they are in determine the type of language they're using. Are they speaking to adults? Are they speaking to peers? Are they in a family setting? Are they in a restaurant setting? Are they in a classroom? All of these things determine the type of language that they're going to use. Now turning to page 12 of the standards document, we can take a look at the Stage 1 settings. 1.0 says that students are using language in highly predictable common daily settings. Again, everything is about them and their immediate environment, and it's highly predictable because they have to have the opportunity to rehearse. Remember, in the culture standard, they could react appropriately to a highly rehearsed situation. Again, this is a highly predictable place that they would use language. Obviously, one of the most highly predictable common setting for them using language is in our classroom.